Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
War, the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam. Can war trigger social change? I happen to have my own predilection that every battle counts, towards social policy.
One thing that's clear of studying all these wars, you've got to have a kind of unity of spirit and effort. You're always going to have dissent.
When a country's at war, all the stresses and strains come out, and you really see the national character. Can it hold together?
It's absolutely indistinguishable with the Civil War. You start with this limited war, and by the end it becomes total war. The first large-scale modern war in American history, more casualties, more deaths in the Civil War than all others combined.
Today, the Civil War on A Biography of America. When William Tecumseh Sherman heard that South Carolina had seceded, he knew it meant war. At the time, he was retired from the Army and was running a military academy in Louisiana. Sherman was a native of Ohio, but he loved the South and had no quarrel with slavery, believing, in his words, that the black man should be subject to the white man. But secession was another matter. He considered South Carolina's break with the Union an act of treason and reckless insanity. As he told an instructor at the academy, "You Southerners underestimate the people of the North. You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth. Right at your doors, you're bound to fail." But because of the intensity of secessionist sentiment, Sherman knew this would be a long, brutal war. Sherman left Louisiana before the attack on Fort Sumter. He returned 2 years later with Ulysses Grant to crush secession. And because the war had changed by then, slavery itself. In 1861, most Northerners believed, as Sherman did, that this must be a war to restore the Union, not to end slavery. But unlike Sherman, they anticipated a quick Union victory with little bloodshed. No one could have imagined how horrible this war would be. By the time it was over, 3 million men had fought, and there were 1 million casualties. 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing in action. 620,000 men died. Think of it. 680,000 have died in all other American wars combined. In a single one-day battle in Antietam Creek, Maryland, 23,000 men fell. That's nearly 4 times the number of American casualties on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. One reason the war was so bloody is because men on both sides were fighting for a cause they believed in to the root of their being. Another has to do with the nature of war. Once begun, war acquires a momentum of its own. Soldiers, generals, presidents start doing what it takes to win. War starts to control them. War brutalizes everyone involved in it because to win, you have to kill and kill and kill. And when you kill that much, you start to get used to it. You get hardened. Changing military technology made this war especially brutal. The most lethal weapon in the war was the rifled musket. It was responsible for up to 90% of combat casualties. In the American Revolution, soldiers fought with smooth-barreled muskets that fired iron balls. But the barrel of the Civil War musket was rifled. It had spiral grooves cut into it. And the projectile wasn't an iron ball. It was a mini ball, which is really not a ball, but a cone-shaped bullet. When fired, it expanded in the barrel, and the rifling gave it a spin, which made it travel further and more accurately. In combat, this rifle had an effective range of about 400 yards, over 4 times that of a Revolutionary War musket. The rifle was doubly deadly because of the failure of military tactics to keep up with military technology. Civil War soldiers fought in Napoleonic style, in the open, standing up, moving forward in long lines, the men marching shoulder to shoulder. The purpose here was to fire in unison, creating the effect of a gigantic shotgun. Now, this could be intimidating, but with a rifled musket, these marching columns took a lot more hits and more accurate hits than attacking soldiers had in the American Revolution. This threw the advantage to the defense, fighting in trenches and behind fortifications. Even though the defense won 9 of 10 Civil War engagements, generals still charged heavily defended positions, recklessly, stubbornly. Military technology was also ahead of medical science, and that increased the butcher's bill even more. Civil War bullets had low muzzle velocity. They rarely cut through the body like a modern steel jacket bullet. Instead, they tumbled around inside the body cavity, causing tremendous damage. A soldier shot in the head or trunk was simply left to die. A man hit in an arm or leg had his wounded limb amputated. And it was the surgeon who sawed it off who was often the patient's worst enemy. Doctors then knew nothing about bacteria. A surgeon would move from patient to patient without washing his hands or instruments, carrying infection with him, killing the men he was trying to save. But it was actually disease that was the greatest Civil War killer. Twice as many soldiers died of disease as were killed in battle. Living on isolated farms, many men hadn't been exposed to common childhood diseases like measles and mumps. When they came into contact with infected soldiers in big, unsanitary army camps, they died in horrifying numbers. This is how soldiers died in camp and in the field from the very start of the war. But over time, the nature of the war changed. And it changed in ways that soldiers couldn't have foreseen. And this increased the intensity of the fighting and the bloodshed. What began as a limited war, a war of soldiers against soldiers, and a war to restore national unity, became by 1863 a total war, a war against civilians as well as soldiers. And more than that, a social revolution, a violent upheaval that destroyed a slaveholding civilization that had lasted for 2.5 centuries. To understand this war, you have to start with geography. The Civil War was fought in 2 main theaters. The East, where most of the fighting occurred in Virginia, and the West, where most of the fighting took place in an area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. In the East, the North's main objective was the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, which was defended by Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Out west, the North's objective was to reopen the Confederate-controlled Mississippi River and to use the river as an invasion highway into the South. The North also employed its Navy to blockade southern ports, hoping to cut off rebel trade with Europe and England particularly. The blockade became increasingly effective as the war proceeded, but the Union Army's Richmond campaign was frustrated by the military genius of Lee and his Chief Lieutenant Stonewall Jackson, and by the extreme, almost inexplicable caution of General George McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan's strategy of conciliation was the Union war policy in the first years of the conflict. He wanted to fight Southerners while protecting their property, including their slaves. McClellan felt that most Southerners were secretly loyal to the Union, and that the war had been brought on by a small clique of rabid secessionists. If the South suffered 1 or 2 tactical defeats with little damage to civilian property, it might be persuaded to rejoin the Union. The problem was, McClellan was never able to win those victories. In the summer of 1862, he bungled a massive campaign to capture Richmond. After this, Lee, his blood up, invaded Maryland, hoping to win a big victory on Union soil that would end the war. McClellan stalked Lee and brought him to conflict at Antietam Creek. The battle ended in a draw, but McClellan allowed Lee's cornered and badly damaged army to escape to Virginia. Then, when he failed to go after Lee, Lincoln, infuriated, removed him from command. But the war didn't go any better for the North. That December, the Army of the Potomac again marched toward Richmond, but Lee cut it to pieces at Fredericksburg, Virginia. "If there's a place worse than hell, I'm in it," Lincoln said at the time. While the war continued to go badly for the Union in the East, out west it won a succession of victories behind Ulysses Grant, the North's first war hero. Grant was a master of river warfare. He worked in tandem with the Navy's powerful ironclad gunboats to push deep into Southern territory, all the way to a place called Shiloh in south-central Tennessee. There, in the spring of 1862, he won a terrible two-day slaughter. More men fell at Shiloh, 20,000, than in all other American wars combined up to that time. That same month, the Union Navy captured New Orleans, the South's major port, and pushed upriver to Vicksburg, Mississippi. But Vicksburg was too tough to take. It sat on commanding bluffs above the river and was heavily fortified. Even so, by the end of 1862, the Union had retaken the Mississippi from the mouth of the Ohio south to Vicksburg, and from New Orleans north to just below Vicksburg. This made Vicksburg the most important strategic point in the Confederacy, the Gibraltar of the South. It was a last obstacle to Union efforts to regain control of the Mississippi and cut the Confederacy in two by isolating rebel territory west of the river, Texas, Arkansas, and parts of Louisiana. Lincoln summed it up. "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to an end until the key is in our pocket. This will be Grant's job." Grant's an amazing story. Just 2 years before this, he was a broken man struggling to support his family as a clerk in his father's harness shop in Galena, Illinois. 1 year after taking Vicksburg, he was put in command of all Union forces in the war. The next year, he'd accept Lee's surrender at Appomattox. 3 years later, he'd enter the White House. No American has ever risen so fast. As a boy growing up in southern Ohio, Grant didn't want to be a soldier, and the sight of blood always made him physically sick. He went to West Point to get a free education, but he got used to Army life and became a hero in the Mexican War. Then, while stationed in California, far away from his family, he started drinking hard, and was pressured to resign from the Army. After this, he failed at one job after another and was nearly destitute when the war rescued him, bringing out capacities even he didn't know he possessed. Grant had done well up to Vicksburg, but Vicksburg would be his supreme test and the turning point of his life. The Vicksburg campaign brought the Union Army for the first time into the heart of cotton culture, and it began, and this is important, at the time Lincoln signed his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. These factors of geography and timing would make it the most important military campaign of the war. With the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln turned a limited war for reunion into a total war against slavery. The proclamation also opened the way for black participation in the fighting. By the end of the war, 180,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army. Lincoln hated slavery, always had, but he hadn't moved against it earlier in the war because he feared that if he did, the border states of Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, where pro-slavery feeling was very strong, would join the Confederacy. It was black slaves themselves who forced his hand by running away in tremendous numbers to invading Union armies. At first, Lincoln ordered his generals to return the fugitive slaves to their owners, but some generals saw the value of using black labor and began keeping runaway slaves as so-called contraband of war. When Congress sanctioned this new policy, it cleared the way for Lincoln to do what he wanted to do all along, declare slaves in rebellious states to be, as he put it, forever free. Lincoln didn't believe, by the way, that he had the constitutional authority to free slaves in states that remained in the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves only in the unconquered portions of the Confederacy. This made it look like an extremely ineffective document, but there was dynamite in it. It turned the Union Army into an army of liberation. From now on, wherever it went, slavery was dead. After Lincoln issued the proclamation, Grant called in his officers and informed them that the war had changed. Now he told them the objective is the complete destruction and subjugation of the South. The Army is to confiscate or destroy Southern crops and livestock and take the enemy's slaves and make soldiers out of the men. Even racist generals like Sherman liked the new policy, not because it helped the slaves, but because it hurt the rebels. It hurt them especially at Vicksburg, and ironically, because Vicksburg was so tough to take. It took Grant 6 months to capture the place, and in trying to capture it, his huge, marauding army roamed over the countryside, confiscating and burning plantations, freeing slaves, and causing general wreck and ruin. For the South, it was a cruel irony. In holding on to Vicksburg, rebel soldiers were losing their farms, losing their slaves, and having their wives and children turned into terror-stricken refugees by Yankee raiders. But maybe the worst indignity, the worst insult of all, was seeing their former slaves in Yankee blue, carrying a musket. In one of the battles of the Vicksburg campaign, Texans went up against newly formed black units of the Union Army. The fighting was unbelievably brutal, hand to hand, and the dead were found wrapped around each other's bodies. It had become a racial war. News of the approach of Grant's soldiers sent Southerners scurrying with their slaves to Texas and South Carolina. It also produced racial panic. Listen to a plantation overseer writing to his absentee master. "All is anarchy and confusion here, everything going to destruction, and the Negroes on the plantation insubordinate. My life has several times been in danger." These same tough Union policies also encouraged thrilling acts of black liberation. I found a diary and archive in which a Southern woman described an old black man breaking in on a white religious service, knowing that Union troops would be there to protect him. When the old man burst through the door and started down the aisle, the enraged minister demanded to know what he was doing. The slave looked him in the eye and said, "I've come here to worship as a free man." Then he took his seat in the front pew. With the Union Army as their shield and sword, slaves themselves helped bring down slavery in this part of the South 2 years before the war ended. This is one of the most important and overlooked outcomes of the Vicksburg campaign. But just as the North began fighting with the gloves off, its fortunes plummeted, and it nearly lost the war. The problem was Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a natural citadel, surrounded by a terrain of incredible difficulty. On the one side, steep, heavily eroded hills, and on the other side, an almost impenetrable swamp, the Yazoo Delta. Adding to Grant's problems, there were torrential winter rains. Grant's soldiers were camped in the mud up to their knees on the Louisiana side of the river and were forced to drink water contaminated by human excrement. It was a formula for disaster, and the men started dying by the hundreds from malaria, dysentery, pneumonia, and smallpox. The dead were buried without coffins on high earthen levees, and when the river rose, corpses were swept downstream. That winter, Grant tried several times to take Vicksburg by cutting through the thick Delta jungle. He even began building a diversionary canal that would have changed the course of the Mississippi River, moving it away from the city and turning Vicksburg into a landlocked and militarily vulnerable place. But every attempt failed, and desertions increased. Many of the men were unwilling to tolerate such conditions in a war that was now being fought, as one racist soldier complained, in his words, for the nigger. Criticism of Grant's incompetence and rumors that he was drinking filled northern newspapers, and there were calls for his removal. Many felt an armistice was inevitable, that the rebels couldn't be conquered. Lincoln was also under pressure to open the river to Midwestern farmers so they could send their corn and wheat to market through New Orleans. If the river remained closed for much longer, Lincoln feared that some states in the Midwest would stop supporting the war. With war morale at an all-time low in the North, Grant appeared to be checkmated. His military career, and with it, the fate of the nation, hung in the balance. Then, in early April, everything changed. The rain stopped, and the bottomlands on the Louisiana side of the river began to dry. This allowed Grant to try a daring invasion plan. It was one of the riskiest moves of the war, and even Sherman pleaded with him not to make it. Grant would march his army down the Louisiana side of the river and make a crossing into Mississippi, below Vicksburg, where there was high, dry ground to operate on. But to get his troops across the river, he'd need gunboats and troop transports, and they'd have to be sent downriver past the guns of Vicksburg. Grant asked for help from the Navy, and his friend, Admiral David Dixon Porter, came through for him. On a cloudless April night, Porter's gunboats floated downriver toward Vicksburg. Their engines were muffled, but they were spotted immediately, and there was a spectacular 3-hour firefight. The people of Vicksburg watched it from the bluffs. Grant, with his wife and kids, watched it from a boat upriver. Sherman watched it from a canoe just across from Vicksburg. Amazingly, all but one of the boats made it through. and on April 30th, Grant's army crossed the Mississippi in what was the largest amphibious landing in American history before the Second World War. The men were in high spirits now. As one of them wrote in his diary, "We've come to redeem this lovely valley of the Mississippi from the fiends and traitors who are desecrating it." That same morning in Virginia, Robert E. Lee was again preparing to meet the Army of the Potomac in what would later be known as the Battle of Chancellorsville. That same evening in Washington, Lincoln waited at the telegraph office for news from both Mississippi and Virginia. Had the Confederates under General John Pemberton concentrated their forces, they might have driven Grant's invasion army back into the river. But they were there only in token force because Grant had executed a series of brilliant diversionary moves. Grant's army was now behind Confederate lines, facing an enemy that outnumbered him, with no communications with the outside world and with only a precarious supply line. This would have paralyzed George McClellan, but Grant was focused, determined, set for the kill. He moved with lightning speed, his army living off the land. In less than 3 weeks, he marched 180 miles, split 2 Confederate armies, won 5 battles, and penned up over 30,000 troops and 3,000 civilians in Vicksburg. It was one of the greatest marches of modern warfare. When he chased the rebel army back into Vicksburg, Grant ordered 2 suicidal assaults on the city's powerful land defenses, but his men were slaughtered in some of the most vicious fighting of the war. So Grant settled in for a siege. Every night his men dug approach trenches toward the Confederate lines. And every day and night his artillery and the Navy's mortar boats pounded the city. For 47 days the 2 armies faced each other at distances, in some places, of less than 25 feet. The rebels were cut off from the world by a circle of fire and were soon reduced to a diet of mule meat and pea bread and rats if they could catch them. Grant meant business. This was the first time in the war that civilians were directly fired upon. After the war, a Yankee soldier tried to explain the Union bombardment. It was cruel and inhumane for our forces to fire on defenseless women and children, but they, like their soldiers, wanted to destroy the Union. The relentless bombardment was nerve-shattering. It was psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of the civilian population. But it only strengthened the resolve of many of the siege victims, especially the women, who hated Yankees intensely. Civilian casualties were surprisingly light, not because the Union didn't fire on civilian targets, as some historians argue, but because of the inaccuracy of Civil War artillery and mortar fire, and because the people of Vicksburg hid in snake-infested caves they dug with the help of their slaves. Heat, hunger, sickness, and exhaustion finally broke the Confederates. On July 4th, 1863, Pemberton surrendered the city and his entire army. Vicksburg wouldn't celebrate the 4th of July for almost another century. The next day, Sherman went on a march through the center of Mississippi to the capital at Jackson, destroying everything in his path. This was a rehearsal for his famous march of devastation through Georgia the following year. On the morning that Vicksburg surrendered, Robert E. Lee was retreating from Pennsylvania after losing the bloodiest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere at a place called Gettysburg. Lee had invaded Pennsylvania after winning a spectacular victory at Chancellorsville. An invasion of the North, he told Jeff Davis, might draw off Yankee troops from Vicksburg. He and Grant had gambled, but there was only one winner. After the war, a Mississippi soldier summed up the significance of the battle he'd fought in. Vicksburg was more momentous in its results than the Battle of Gettysburg. It severed the Confederacy in twain, gave the enemy complete control of the Mississippi River, and enabled the foe to establish himself in the very vitals of the South and to gnaw to death from within. Vicksburg was an ominous harbinger for the South. It would be beaten in this war, not by a series of climactic battles like Gettysburg, but by unremitting warfare on soldiers as well as civilians, executed with unblinking efficiency by the heroes of Vicksburg, Grant and Sherman. They were the generals who brought old Dixie down. With the benefit of hindsight, it's tempting to see the twin victories of Vicksburg and Gettysburg sealing the fate of the South. But the war would drag on for 2 more years and would become even more vicious. The letters of soldiers who surrendered at Vicksburg give part of the reason why. Exhausted, homesick, humiliated by defeat, Confederate Private F.N. Kaler was still determined to fight on. "Don't get discouraged," he wrote his brother. "We'll win our independence. The Lord is on our side." After Vicksburg, Lincoln warned the American people against overconfidence. "Let us not be oversanguine of a speedy triumph. Let us diligently apply the means, never doubting that just God, in his good time, will give us the right result." This was the same just God Private Kaler was banking on, but with both sides convinced of the morality of their cause, Lincoln was right. There was a lot more fighting ahead.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.